Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at some sample questions and answers for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. The topic of this week's questions is languages. So quite an interesting topic, again a bit of a surprising one, but that's the whole idea of part 1, is that the examiners try to surprise you a little bit so they can hear your natural spoken English. What I'll do is go through the 4 questions we'll be looking at first, just thinking about what they're asking us to do and what they require of us, and of course that will give you a chance to think about what your answers would be to these questions. After we've looked at the questions, I'll go through some sample answers. I'll just read them out first so you can listen to them. And then, of course, after that, I'll give a short analysis of why they're really good and appropriate answers for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. We have to remember in this part of the test, we don't need to do too much. These are short, simple questions that are just being asked kind of just to get to know the person who's speaking in the test room. It's all questions about you, and you have to give that information about yourself nice and clearly and concisely. We don't want to give answers that are too long. If you remember in other videos that we've done with sample answers for part 1, we're looking at a kind of 2-sentence answer. Nice and clear, nothing longer than that. And that's what we're going to see today in the sample answers that we will look at. Now, first of all, let's look at these 4 questions. I said, of course, they're on the topic of languages, so that will be the focus of all 4 questions. But each question will be doing something slightly different, getting you to show some different skills in English. So if we have a look at the first question, here it is. How many languages can you speak? So a pretty simple question there, not too complex. It's a how many question. So of course we have to give the number of languages that we can speak to give a nice direct answer. The question's focused on the present tense, so really the answer is going to be focused in that tense as well. But again, nothing really too complex so far, just a simple how many question. And of course it's directed at the speaker. You, of course, it's not about someone else, it's about the person answering the question, which is the normal style of question for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. Now if we move on to look at the second question, we've got how useful will English be to you in your future? So this is a slightly different kind of question here for sure. Yes, it starts with the word how, again, which is similar to the previous question, but we're following how with not how many, but how useful. We've got the adjective useful. So we've got to measure that in our answer. Is it going to be very useful or not very useful or quite useful, right? We need to be kind of using that adjective in our answer, of course, because that's the focus of the question. Also here, you'll notice the question is not about the present. It's about the future. How useful will English be to you in your future? Makes it very, very clear, right? With the word will and also the phrase in your future. Of course, we're going to have to talk about the future. Not now, not the past, but the future. And again, you'll find these part 1 questions are often testing out your kind of ability to use different verb tenses. They want to kind of hear that straight away, that we're able to control verbs well. So when you're answering, you've got to make sure, well, firstly, you're listening carefully to the tense of the question, but then you're kind of copying the grammar from the question. So that's the second one. The third question, again, is a bit different. What do you remember about learning languages at school? So of course, it's not a how question anymore, it's a what question. So again, that gives us a bit of variety, but here it's what do you remember? Now this is a bit different because of course, well, you're remembering now in the present, but it's kind of about the past, right? So there's a chance that when you're answering this kind of question, you're going to be using the past tenses a bit. And of course, the topic is about learning languages at school. So specifically at school. So this is going to be the past for most of us. Right, let's move on to the fourth and final question, which again you can see here begins with the word what. What do you think would be the hardest language for you to learn? So this looks a bit more similar to the kind of questions we get in part 3. It's asking you what you think, what your opinion is. But it's slightly different because, of course, it's your opinion on the hardest language that you would find to learn. Okay, so it's focused on you and not people in general. So that's why we're seeing it in part 1 here and not part 3. And the focus is the hardest language, which of course means the most difficult language for you to learn. So of course, really in the answer, you need to kind of give the language, choose the language that you think would be the hardest to learn, and then explain why as well afterwards. Remember, we're always going to have that kind of second sentence in our answers where we give a kind of reason or explanation for our first sentence. But again, we'll look at the answers in a bit and see how we're kind of focusing on these questions in the answer, fully answering them, but doing no more than that. A lot of the time I find when students answer questions in part 1, especially if they have quite a high ability, they'll give answers that are a bit too long. And you don't need to do that. Often if you do that, then you're going to go off topic a bit, not focus on the question enough, and really other parts of the IELTS speaking test are getting you to speak at length, to speak more and give more detailed answers. Part 1's not really for that. They're just checking that you have the ability to speak fluently, clearly and concisely in English. Right, let's move on then and look at some of the sample answers to these questions. After we've looked at the sample answers, of course, I'll give a quick analysis of those 4 answers too. But first of all, let's just go through all 4 of the answers so you can see them and maybe compare them with what you were thinking your answers to these questions would be. So if you remember, the first question was, how many languages can you speak? Obviously, I can speak my mother tongue, and of course my English is pretty good. That's 2. And although I can speak a little in other languages, I'm far from fluent. How useful will English be to you in your future? Hopefully really useful. I'm planning to do my master's degree in the UK if I do well enough in this test. What do you remember about learning languages at school? I have quite fond memories of learning English at school. The teacher made it interesting and I was always keen to learn more in class. What do you think would be the hardest language for you to learn? Well, that's a difficult question. If I had to choose one language, it would be Chinese. I just think the difference between this language and my first language is massive, and that would make it harder to learn. There we go. So those are the 4 answers to those 4 questions. And you'll see none of them are that long. None of them are too short either though, right? They both kind of, they all answer the questions fully. They're all around 2 sentences. That's what you would have maybe noticed. There was one of the answers that was a bit longer than that, but I'll explain that in a bit when we look at that answer. And now if you remember the first answer we gave to the first question, which was about how many languages you can speak. Of course, if you look at this answer here, you can see that it's 2 sentences long, and we're copying words and grammar from the question. We're saying, I can speak. Well, we've got the word can and speak that was in the question. And of course, we've got a few phrases here that pretty sure you'll be aware of. I can speak my mother tongue, which is your first language, okay, the language you learned from your parents. And of course, my English is pretty good. So there we go. Straight away, we've given 2 languages in the answer. We've given how many? Straight away in that first sentence there. Mother tongue and English. That's 2. 2 languages. Of course, we made that more clear now in the second sentence. We've said that's 2. So of course, we've linked those 2 sentences with the pronoun that, and we've given the number 2. Okay, so we've made it extra clear. And then we give a bit more detail. We're doing that with an although sentence. And although I can speak a little in other languages, I'm far from fluent. So of course, we're not going to say we can really speak those languages because we are far from fluent, which means not fluent at all. Okay, a very long way off being fluent in a language. You're far from fluent. But again, nothing that complex in that answer, just 2 nice clear sentences explaining how many languages we can speak. Focused on the present tense as well, of course, because the question is. Now, if we move on to the second answer that I gave to the second question, which was the how useful question. How useful will English be to you in your future? So of course, we've just answered very directly in that first sentence there. Not even really a full sentence. Hopefully, really useful. It's okay to answer like this sometimes with a very short phrase, as long as we go into a bit more detail afterwards. We have used the adjective useful, and we've shown how useful by using the word really, the adverb really before useful. Of course, we could use the word very as well, but we've got really useful there. Now, of course, after that, we explain it a bit. Notice here how we're referring to the future by using the phrase I'm planning to. Now, of course, we can think, well, yes, that's present continuous, but we're talking about the future, our plans. I'm planning to do my master's degree in the UK. So here, of course, we're giving a reason why it's going to be useful. If you're going to do that, English is going to be useful if I do well enough in the test. So we leave that condition, of course, and that is my plan if this test goes well. So yes, nice clear answer, quite a short answer there, right? But it clearly answers the question. Now, if we move on to the third answer, to the question, what do you remember about learning languages at school? So this is about your memories of the past. And you look there in the answer, of course, we have tried to paraphrase a little bit by, well, not using the word remember, but using the noun memories. I have quite fond memories. Good memories, fond memories of learning English at school. So there we go. We've copied words and grammar from the question. Of course, remember is remembering now. So you have those memories now. So we have used the present tense in this first sentence. But of course, in the second sentence, I'm going to explain more. So I'm going to be describing these times in the past. So you can see here we said the teacher made it interesting. Not makes, right? It's not now, it's the past. So made it interesting. And I was always keen to learn more in class. So was as well, referring to the past. So again, nothing too complex. 2 nice, concise sentences giving a nice, clear answer. Now, if we move on to the fourth and final answer, that was to the question, what do you think would be the hardest language for you to learn? And again, kind of connected to your opinion, but your opinion about yourself and how you would find something easy or difficult. Now, of course, you can see here we've answered in a slightly different way. We haven't gone straight into an answer. We've commented on the question. We've said, well, that's a difficult question. Of course, I don't think it's a good idea to always do this. Some students have this habit of commenting on a question to buy them a little bit of time to think about it. Sometimes it sounds a little unnatural, but if you really think a question is difficult, it's okay to say that, right? It's fine. And maybe the person answering this question honestly thinks that's quite a difficult question. They've never thought about it before. But then, of course, we still attempt to give an answer. So we've used a if sentence here. If I had to choose one language, it'd be Chinese. We've used some nice contractions there with which helps with our pronunciation score, right? It'd be Chinese rather than it would be. Okay, of course we're using a conditional sentence there. But the key thing here, and probably the most important thing, is that we've chosen a language, Chinese. So we've answered the question. And then, of course, we've explained it a bit in the sentence after that. I just think the difference between this language, which of course is referring to Chinese, so we're linking the sentences, and my first language is massive, really, really big, right? They're so different. There's a lot of difference between these two languages, and that would make it harder to learn. Okay, so we're using a different form of the word from the question, which was hardest, the superlative. Of course, we said it's harder, which really in this context has the same purpose. So there we go. A nice clear answer. The longest answer there, I mean, you can see it's got 3 sentences, but again, it's not too long. Still kept it concise. We haven't gone off topic. We've still stayed on the topic of the question and answered it nice and clearly. You can see with all of these answers, that's really what they're doing. They're just answering the question and doing no more than that. We're not trying too hard to impress the examiner with our grammar or vocabulary. We're just using the kind of words that a native speaker would use naturally in everyday conversation. We're not trying to sound like a professor or some kind of genius, right? It's a lot of students misunderstand this and often try too hard in part 1, right? And you really don't need to do that. Part 2 and part 3 is where you get to really impress the examiner. So hopefully those sample answers were useful for you to look at and maybe could help you with your own answers to these 4 questions here, maybe even other questions that you get in part 1, the whole kind of approach to answering these questions that you saw with these answers could help you when you answer your own questions when you're in the test. If you have found the video useful, then do remember to click the like button. And if you haven't already, then subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you again in the next video.